Dying industries are a regular feature of economic policy discussions. Is saving an industry a worthwhile goal for economic policy, or would a tough love approach be better? With me is David Seymour from the Frontier Center for Public Policy.
Hi.
To start, we regularly observe industries in trouble asking for help. Recently in Canada, we saw the auto and forest industries ask for assistance. Here in Saskatchewan, there's been a debate over the future of Prince Albert Pulp and Paper Mill. Why are dying industries such a recurring theme?
Well, it's a combination of two conflicting factors. On the one hand, economic conditions constantly change. New technology is invented, new producers enter the global marketplace, and consumer tastes change. In the case of the Canadian paper mills, for example, people are moving from encyclopedias and newspapers to the internet, so changing technology is reducing the demand for paper. There are also new paper producers from places such as China entering the marketplace. There are increasing restrictions on timber harvesting for environmental reasons. All of these changes are very difficult for the industry to control, but they do harm the existing industry. The other factor is that vested interests want to stay in with the paper mills. And there are many workers, investors, and closely related industries that want the mills to stay open, regardless of the success or failure in the market. The conflict between changing economic conditions and vested interests means that dying industries often become a political issue because the industry wants to be saved against the odds.
What do you mean when you talk about saving an industry?
Well, there are two broad approaches. One is to try and protect those already in the industry by barring new competitors from entering it. The other is to simply give a direct subsidy to those already in the industry.
Starting with the first approach, what are the wider economic consequences of restricting access to a troubled industry?
Well, incumbent producers in this case will say, our industry is overcrowded, we're facing too many competitors, the government should stop competitors from entering the market. And the problem with that is if the industry was really overcrowded, why would anyone else want to get into it? And the fact that some people apparently do want to enter the industry suggests that they see it as the best option for their time or their investment. Now, restricting access to the industry means that these people must take some second best option. It protects the industry insiders at the expense of all others.
So this is about creating the impression of a dying industry where others disagree so much that they'd actually like to get in on it.
Well, yes, and the taxi industry is one such industry in Canada. The dairy industry is another. In both cases, the law limits the number of producers in the industry. In both cases, insiders say that there's already too much competition, but of course they would. All of us would like to have a monopoly if we could. The result is that willing investors and workers are kept out of those industries, and consumers pay higher prices due to less competition.
It still seems as if we're talking about an industry that really isn't dying. We started with the idea that changing economic conditions actually can make industries non-viable, in which case restrictions on competition wouldn't be necessary, because nobody wants to enter a truly dying industry.
Well, sure, that's when the second approach to the so-called saving of industries comes in. It's when governments give a direct subsidy or a discounted loan, which in effect is a kind of subsidy, to existing producers in an industry. And the 2009 bailout of North American automakers was a classic example of that. The result here is actually the opposite of restricting the number of workers and investors from entering an industry. Instead of the government preventing investment in an industry, it's effectively forcing people to invest through their taxes. The result is the same, though, in as much as people are drawn away from their preferred activity or investment and directed to one the government wants them to support. If you believe in the wisdom of crowds, then you should expect this kind of intervention will lead to poorer quality investment decisions overall.
It may seem clear that saving industries is a public expense and that having governments commandeer work and investment decisions makes people poorer on average. But if you look at the industries that are saved and all the other industries that depend on them, such as the auto part makers who depend on the big automakers, can't it be a worthwhile investment?
Well, that's always the argument. What about all the people who depend on this industry? The argument is the same, though. Saving dependents of a dying industry is no different in principle to saving the initial industry. A further issue, though, is that keeping workers and investors in a dying industry also means keeping them out of a growing one.
So you're talking about Joseph Schumpeter's creative destruction.
Yes, so very much so. Because workers and investors have limited time and money, they have to be able to move freely to the industries that consumers actually want to support. Whether that means getting into an industry some say is dying, or getting out of one that some say needs saving. What if the horse and carriage industry had been saved from the car industry, for example? What if investors who wanted to invest in the car industry were forced to pay taxes that became investments in the buggy industry? What if consumers were subsidized in order to keep them buying carriages and horses? Those industries would be saved, sure, but the transport industry would be a lot more primitive nowadays. It's ironic that North American automakers are now the ones asking for more protection.
This still sounds very harsh from the point of view of dying industries and for the people that work for them.
Well, there's no denying that. You know, when you see the boarded up and broken windows of factories in a city like Detroit, say, it's easy to be caught up in the drive to save industries. The important thing, though, is to look at the long-term effects on all groups rather than the short-term effects on some. And I hope I've shown that saving industries is not in the average person's long-term interest.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you.
To summarize, the changing economic conditions and vested interests often clash, resulting in calls to save dying industries. Often governments will try to protect current industry players by stopping new workers or investors entering the market, or by using taxes to invest in the existing players. Saving industries inevitably stops people moving their time and investments to more efficient industries, thus reducing overall wealth in the long term. In the next discussion, we'll explore the role of prices. Aside from being too low or too high, depending on your perspective, how do prices help coordinate economic activity? Until then, I'm Jamie Stevenson, and this has been On the Other Hand.